So when I talk about the human condition in this way, I'm often asked, am I talking about original sin? And as a theologian, I'm allowed to give a very straightforward yes and no at the same time. If your definition of original sin is a guilt-ridden state in which all people are born into a state of wickedness, or if you say by original sin that we take the moral blame for our first parents' actions, or if you mean by original sin some sort of collective culpability of all people, then that's not what the human condition means. And I think that concept is what is rightly rejected in contemporary theology. People don't like to talk about original sin because those are the images that it conjures up. But many of the best theologians in the church and official church documents still refer to a concept of original sin. I happen to agree with them. So what do they mean by original sin? Well, in the negative, they don't mean that we are born into a state of personal, actual sin. To actually sin, we need to act with moral reason and do something specifically wrong. And original sin as such doesn't mean that the moral guilt of our parents or our ancestors is inherited by us. Essentially, we're not born guilty. We're not punishable for being human and imperfect, even though we are imperfect. This sort of misunderstanding, I think, is what people have rejected, but unfortunately, people often reject the term original sin because they like to throw the baby out with the bathwater. How can we talk about original sin then? The first thing is to clarify the issue by saying that original sin doesn't mean original or sin in the normal, conventional senses of the words. When we speak of sin, we're speaking analogically. That is, our human condition is something that ultimately tarnishes our relationship with God. By analogy, it's an objectively disordered situation. It's not a subjective state of being. Now, because it is disordered, it's wrong, because it falls short of the image of God that we're meant to be. By analogy or similitude, it's called sin. So our humanity as a universal condition, the human condition which is universal, implies that there is something in our very foundations or roots of being human. And so again, by analogy, this situation is called original. So the human condition, imperfection, ambivalence, original sin, whatever you want to call it, is a theological recognition that we are ambivalent creatures. We're under the constant offer of the love and grace of God, but we find ourselves ambivalent, wavering creatures who sometimes respond well to God, other times don't. The human condition, importantly, is not a judgment of moral guilt upon a person, but the way that I like to put it is that it's a burden that we bear. It's a burden that we all come into the world with, so to that extent it's original. It's a burden that keeps us from the full glory of humanity that we're destined to. Having said all that, I've spoken about a lot of theory, but I want to end this particular video on a pastoral note. The doctrine of original sin has a bad reputation for laying a burden upon people, and yet I find a very positive side to it. I consider it this way: we're all imperfect. We all succeed sometimes, we fail other times. We are ambivalent. Should we feel guilty for being imperfect? Does my personal ambivalence towards God merit some sort of condemnation? I would answer no. If we accept the reality that as a human race we all have an imperfect, ambivalent character, then we don't need to feel personally guilty about our imperfection. Guilt and punishment are fitting only towards those who personally and consciously decide to take a negative course of action. On the other hand, There should be no culpability attached to being born human. And so what's the importance of that? What I'm saying is that recognizing the human condition, we should and we can treat ourselves with mercy. That's very important. Once you recognize that we are human, we know that we should adopt towards ourselves an attitude of mercy. And then very importantly, we should let that flow to others. We should treat other people with mercy. When we encounter ourselves and others as being humanly imperfect, our first response should be mercy. Human imperfection is not our own fault, and we should be able to pardon ourselves, even treat ourselves gently, when sometimes we experience ourselves as imperfect or ambivalent. From another perspective, what I'm saying is that by acknowledging our human ambivalence and the fact that it is a universal, original condition of humanity, rather than condemning ourselves, we can treat ourselves with mercy, treat others with mercy, and importantly, be open then to the mercy of God. We should do that rather than treating ourselves with denial, suppression, and expecting God to act towards us in the same way. In other words, Christian belief in the human condition, in original sin as such, should be part of the good news. It's a recognition that we are imperfect. It's not our own personal fault that we come into the world with this burden. We are responsible for what we do with it, but it should also open ourselves up to the good news of God's mercy and God's redemption. And I want to speak about that redemption in the next video.